There's an all-too-common misconception on the internet today. A bold hypothesis is drawn from subjective data that's either misinterpreted or misrepresented. Even in cases where the claim might have some truth, it does not necessarily support the proposed hypothesis. Now, in my last video I mentioned that Sigmund Freud learned hypnosis while translating for Jean-Martin Charcot, but there's more to that story. The idea of hypnosis came from a physician named Franz Anton Mesmer, who theorized that certain conditions like hysteria were the result of a misalignment of magnetic energy flow in the body. In 1774, he had a patient ingest an iron solution, and then he attached magnets to various parts on her body. She reported feeling a mysterious fluid running through her, and her symptoms were temporarily relieved. But Mesmer was getting a placebo effect, and therefore the results were not repeatable by experiment. So Mesmer concluded that it wasn't the magnets, but he must have contributed something special, something he called animal magnetism. So he threw away his magnets and started to channel this mysterious energy flow through his bare hands, and he did this until 1777, when a few scandals led Mesmer to flee Vienna and go start trouble in Paris. Once there, he tried and failed to get either the Royal Society of Medicine or the Royal Academy of Sciences to provide an official approval for his theory. And then in 1784, without his request, King Louis XVI ordered an investigation into animal magnetism. 5 special commissioners from the Royal Academy of Sciences were involved, and one of them was Benjamin Franklin. The commission concluded that Dr. Mesmer's results were due to imagination, not a magnetic fluid in the body that could not be found. Even though Dr. Mesmer did have data from cases where he was able to provide patients with symptomatic relief, there was still no reason to accept his crazy hypothesis. I mention this story because I think the pitfalls in Mesmer's thinking are very similar to those in many conspiracy theories. The misconceptions drawn generate fear that prevents humanity from addressing real problems that seem to be within our ability to solve today. The general hypothesis I'm talking about is the bedrock of all conspiracy theories. It's based on a false premise, and is therefore inherently flawed as a result. There's never any mention of the real solutions to the real problems that are misrepresented to support the hypothesis. Instead, it just generates fear and a sense of learned helplessness in the viewer.
Thank you, Mr. Mackey, students of South Park Elementary. I'm here to educate you about the single biggest threat to our planet. You see, there is something out there which threatens our very existence and may be the end to the human race as we know it. I'm talking, of course, about Man-Bear-Pig. Man-Bear-Pig doesn't care who you are or what you've done. Man-Bear-Pig simply wants to get you. I'm super serious.
I know they're hurting us. I know they're carrying out New World Order. I know they...
Like Dr. Mesmer, Alex Jones makes a bold hypothesis based on subjective data. Data that he's either misinterpreting or intentionally misrepresenting. I'll let you decide which one. The data includes things like fluoride in U.S. water supply, thimerosal in vaccines, corruption in government and business, and the 9/11 truth movement. The hypothesis he offers, based on his expert analysis of the hand-picked data, is that the bad guys are trying to limit population to 500 million by exterminating people through what Jones calls soft kill techniques. Now, I don't want to waste time debunking what's already been debunked in other videos, but I will go on record and say that your drinking water and vaccines are safe, and the claims made by the 9/11 truth movement are not true. So sure, there's plenty of examples of corruption in government and business, but that's a symptom of a deeper problem. And that's why I tried to explain Freud's model of the mind, and how it influenced people like his nephew to develop the engineering of consent and the Council on Public Relations. It's not an evil attempt to control you. Rather, it was an approach to manage society that was based on a model of human nature that we now know to be inaccurate. This is very similar to the problems with the eugenics movement and its founder Francis Galton. The radical sterilization laws and the opinions developed by both public and political figures were based on what we now know to be a pseudoscience. This is understandable if we consider that The Origin of Species was published in 1859. Here we are 150 years later, and there's still many widely held misconceptions about evolution, especially when it comes to the notion of survival of the fittest. Now, there were many scholars even in Galton's time who held a very different interpretation of evolution, and today we have a much better understanding of biology, and that's why the scientific community does not share the views of people like Alex Jones. After all, what is fitness? In health science, this is what we mean, but in biology it refers to how well an organism relates and adapts to its environment. From a eugenics perspective, people who carry a genetic disease should have their reproductive rights compromised for the good of society. Well, what about the gene for sickle cell anemia? A single dose of that gene actually grants immunity to malaria. So is it a good gene or a bad gene? Likewise, for thousands of years our genes have developed to actually store body fat to ensure survival. But now that interferes with our quest for beauty. So are these fat genes good or bad? We have to understand that people like Francis Galton and Eddie Bernays are not bad guys. Their methods are not evil, and their intent was not cynical. But their respective fields of science have come a long way, and the views that they held in the late 1800s are far from the academic consensus held today. People like these info warriors like to look back with a paranoid disposition coupled with a lack of education, and then they come to the conclusion that the bad guys are out to get them. There are very real problems in the world today, and Alex Jones might point out a few of them. But just like with Dr. Mesmer, we're under no obligation to accept his hypothesis. Now, to put it nicely, his broadcast is not conducive to the well-being of people, and that's because he misrepresents information and benefits financially from it. He has no scientific training or credentials that I can find any reference to, and his general hypothesis, on which many conspiracy theories are based, is fundamentally flawed. And you always want to ask yourself who's behind all this, but whoever it is, one thing's for sure. The theory is based on two presuppositions that are false. In regards to the first, I'd like to quote President Abraham Lincoln. Isaac Newton also offers a few words of wisdom that can help us out here. And he was a smart guy, but turn on the Discovery Channel and you'll learn things that Newton was unaware of. Things like general relativity and evolution are now explained to the public in about 1 hour plus commercials. And that doesn't make us smarter than Newton. It just means that we have more shoulders like his to stand on. So imagine taking a group of people and presenting them with all the evidence for and against two opposing models of our solar system. One model is geocentric and the other is heliocentric, and then ask people which model they freely believe in their own personal opinion is more accurate. Now they're going to choose the heliocentric model because it makes more sense, and it makes more sense because it's more accurate. Whenever we first comprehend a new truth, it comes with a feeling of familiarity, very similar to what Plato described in the dialogue Meno. But that's a whole nother story. The point that I'm trying to make here is that it's easier to recognize something that's true than to believe something that we know to be untrue. The bad guys can't fool everyone, and even if they could, that deception can't last indefinitely. It only takes one educated skeptic to call bullshit and post it on YouTube for the entire house of cards to collapse. There's no such thing as total control. Now the second presupposition is a bit different because throughout history there have been ruling classes. And there were benefits to being in that club, so the tendency was to keep it in the family and oppress others. But what if it became known that that strategy, which was once very successful, was now actually harming both classes? It would make sense for the survival strategy to change. Now let's take a look at one of these blue-blooded elites and make a list of the things that they benefit from the most. Vaccines and penicillin are first on the list, and if they want to go to their Bilderberg meetings and their child-sacrificing rituals at Bohemian Grove, they need planes, trains, and automobiles. I would also put electricity, pasteurization, the telephone, and the PlayStation on this list. All of these things that make the individual life better are from other people's contribution to society. There's no genetically superior type of person because survival of the fittest doesn't mean what most people think it means. Human beings are a social species, just like ants and bees and many others. Individually, they're helpless, but as a unified group, they're unstoppable. So why would a group of elites expend so much energy on this endgame when modern science knows better? An educated population doesn't need to be controlled.
We feel an educated population needs no control.
You wouldn't stop sex?
No, sir.
If the elite are really out for themselves, then it would make more sense for them to make the tools of learning and the necessities of life as accessible as possible. It would be more cost-effective, and surprisingly the elite would benefit even more. That's because it's not blue bloods and politicians that make all the things that improve the quality of life. It's crafty technicians, clever inventors, witty comedians, and talented artists and musicians. If this group of child-sacrificing Bohemian Grove Bilderbergers really does exist, then their stupidity far exceeds their evil.